So welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to discuss how to remember more of what you read. I'm Paul Nowak, the founder of Iris Reading, and I want to thank you for showing up today. We actually had a full registration list, so we had to close the webinar. So for those of you that are here, thank you so much. We're going to get right into it. And when we're talking about remembering more of what we read, we're really dealing with a memory-related topic here. And it's not just, we don't just forget what we read, we've forgotten other types of things, where we put our house keys, people's names. So I want to start with things that we commonly forget. For example, why is it so easy to forget someone's name? I mean, we've all had that situation where sometimes we get introduced to somebody, they tell us their name, and we've immediately forgotten their name. Part of that has to do with paying attention. Sometimes we're not paying attention to begin with, and actually you can argue that sometimes the name never gets retained to begin with. So everything when we're talking about remembering what we read has to do with starting off with paying attention. So trying to make sure that we're concentrated and focused on the task at hand. But there's another reason why it's so easy to forget names, and also why it's so easy to forget what we read, and that has to do with abstract versus visual information. Abstract information is always going to be harder to remember than visual information. I'll give you an example of abstract versus visual information. If you look on the screen right now, this is actually known as the Baker-Baker paradox. And here's how it works. They took a group of people and they asked them to, they introduced them to a person, and this person's name was Mr. Baker. And the next day they took that same group and they just asked them casually, do you remember what this person's name was? And most of the people, about 90% of them, couldn't remember that the person's name was Mr. Baker. Now, contrast that with another group of people where they introduced them to someone and they mentioned that this person is a baker. That's that person's occupation. The next day, they ask them the same question. Do you remember what this person does for a living? And 90% of them were able to remember that this person is a baker as part of their occupation. Now, why is it that the same word, baker, in two different contexts is either easy to remember or extremely hard to remember for most people? It has to do with abstract versus visual. Names are very abstract. Mr. Baker, it only gives you kind of one connection point in your brain. It's just, it doesn't connect to any kind of visual. However, if somebody says that they were a baker, that's what they do for a living, even if they're just dressed casually, what do you visualize them when they tell you they're a baker? You might visualize them with a top hat, maybe, some flour on their hands. We have this visualization of what a baker might look like. So what happens is we start making more connections in our brain, and the more connections in our brain that we make to a word like baker, the easier it's going to be to remember. So part of the reason why it's so easy to forget someone's name is because when they mention to you their name, like I mentioned my name at the beginning of this webinar, some of you may have already forgotten it because, it's abstract. But if you can somehow visualize the name, and by the way, there's all sorts of, we're not going to get into how to remember names in this particular webinar. We've done webinars on that in the past. And if you do, by the way, want me to email you information about that webinar, my contact information's on the screen. I'll send that over to you. But the reason why I'm pointing this out with abstract versus visual information is because when we're reading, we're dealing with a lot of abstract information. It's actually, when you have the name, the funny thing is you remember the person's face very easily. Why? Because you see the face. You forget their name. Why? Because you don't really see their name. They just tell you the name. And that's why abstract information is harder to remember, because it's abstract. You can't see it. Now, let's talk about some ways that we can actually take abstract information and remember it better. Think about this. How do songs get stuck in your head? It's all about repetition. Repetition helps you remember things. So when you have abstract information, for example, the words, the lyrics in a song, the way that you take that abstract information, you're not really turning it into visual information. You're taking that abstract information, and the fact that you hear a song over and over, that's how a song gets stuck in your head. Nobody remembers a song by hearing it just once and remembering all the lyrics to it, unless it's one of those dumb songs where they just repeat the same thing over and over again. What happens is repetition helps you remember things. Now, with reading, how do we get some repetition? Well, one way is to just reread the material that you already read, but that's not really convenient. Nobody wants to, for the sake of repetition, read a chapter over and over and over again just to get it repetitively in their head. That's going to be very time consuming. But there are some other less time consuming ways that we can get the repetition in to remember things. And one way that a lot of you are probably familiar with is note taking. A lot of people forget that note taking is a form of repetition, and just the action of taking notes helps you remember the information. You ever take notes and never look at them? Again, we've all probably done this at some point. Think about this. If you take notes, what's the purpose of taking notes? It's to refer back to them later on. But we've all taken notes and sometimes never looked at them again. And they did studies to see if you take notes and you don't look at them again, what's the point of taking notes? Why even bother? Is it a waste of time? And what they find is that it's not a waste of time. Just the action of writing something down is a form of repetition. It helps you remember things a little better. Now, if you happen to refer back to it and reread your notes, that's another form of repetition, and that will help you remember it even better. But keep in mind, just the action of taking notes is a simple way to get that repetition in. Now, what are some other ways that we can get the repetition? Well, first of all, a lot of times when I talk about note-taking, the first question I get is, how should I take notes? When should I take notes? Should I take them, the moment I read something important? Should I take it at the end of the chapter? Should I take it in the middle, at the end of a section? And what happens, a lot of people make the mistake of taking notes at the wrong time. So, for example, let's say they're studying for a test, and they read something really, really important, and they feel like they have the need to write it down. What you should probably do is wait until you finish a paragraph or a section before taking those notes. And let me explain why. If you've ever bought a used college textbook, you've probably seen excessive highlighting. How does excessive highlighting happen? What happens is someone is reading something that they really need to remember, so they read something important and they feel like it's important, so they highlight it. And then they read the next sentence, and it turns out that sentence is pretty important as well, so they highlight that as well. And then they end up reading the third sentence, and it turns out this third sentence is the summary of the paragraph. It's the most important sentence there. And then they decide, well, if I highlighted the other two, I probably should highlight this one again. And now they've highlighted maybe all or most of the paragraph. The problem with taking notes in that kind of a manner is it kind of reminds me of this phrase that a lot of us have heard: when you get caught up in the details, you lose sight of the big picture. And you want to avoid taking notes after just reading one sentence. You want to at least finish the paragraph, and then you can tell what was the most important part of that, and then you can just highlight it. Now, if you're going to highlight, that's one way to take notes. Another way to take notes would be maybe writing in the margins. So the next question, I guess, is how should you take notes? Should I be highlighting? Should I be writing on a separate sheet of paper? Should I be doing outlines? There's all sorts of ways that you could be taking notes. So I want to go over some different ways, and you could really break down note-taking into linear notes versus non-linear notes. Let me explain linear notes. We've all done outlines. That's an example of linear-based notes. Now, there's good and bad to linear-based notes. The good is you have some order, a step one, a step two. It organizes the information. But the problem with linear notes is, like outlines, they don't apply to everything. Outlines are very well suited for topics like history, where World War II should probably come after World War I. So you have a certain order, a chronological order. But a lot of the things that you study are not necessarily, they don't lend themselves always to linear-based notes. A lot of things lend themselves to nonlinear notes. So mind mapping is actually a form of nonlinear-based notes. And the way mind maps work, if you look on the screen here, this is an example of a mind map. You have some central topic, and outside of that topic, you have different concepts, and then the details that follow. Now, linear notes, again, I mentioned they're more suited for ordered information. Nonlinear notes would be useful for, let's say you had a topic like physics. The topic of physics, you don't necessarily have to go in a certain order. There are a lot of things involved with physics. There's, we could talk about Isaac Newton and his laws of motion, Einstein's theories of relativity. We could talk about quantum mechanics, string theory. There's all sorts of things involved with physics. And the same thing goes for topics like law. Are we talking about contract law, intellectual property law, labor law, constitutional law? You could say the same thing about marketing. Are we talking about online marketing or offline marketing? Is it word of mouth? Is it, online advertising? There's all sorts of, and topics like those, and most of the topics that we end up learning about are set up in a way where they lend themselves to nonlinear information. And the reason why they call it mind maps, is because they reflect the way your mind works a lot more accurately than linear-based notes. Your mind doesn't really work in this kind of a manner. Your mind is a lot more like a mind map where we remember information sometimes in out of order, or we remember things in clusters. One thing reminds us of another thing. If you do like taking mind maps, or you want to take mind maps, you could either do it by hand, or if you prefer to do it on the computer, there's a couple applications that I would recommend. Basically, these are two applications. MindMeister we actually use internally here at Iris. We use it for brainstorming. I use it for note-taking. I use it for all sorts of reasons, but it's web-based. That's MindMeister. I also use Xmind if I'm not connected to the internet. I'm not able to get on MindMeister, so Xmind is actually a downloadable program that works on a Mac or a PC. Xmind is free. I know MindMeister is subscription-based, and I think they have like a free 30-day trial. You can check out either one. And by the way, these are outside of Iris. We don't get any kind of monetary compensation from either one of them for recommending. I'm just letting you know about applications that I tend to use. So if you do like mind mapping, these are two applications, and keep in mind, taking notes, whether it's an outline or a mind map, taking notes helps you remember things. So always remember this. Repetition is going to help you remember things. Now, what are some other ways that we can get repetition in to improve our understanding and our recall of the material? There is this reading strategy that we call the multiple reading process, and it's a 3-step approach to reading most types of material. So when I say most types of material, I would say this is probably more suited towards informational material than fiction. So you don't necessarily need to use this on a novel. But let me explain how this process works. The first step is a preview. And the preview is simply reading your introduction and your conclusion. So if you're reading an article that's a few pages long in a magazine, you might read the first and last paragraph. If you were reading a textbook chapter, you might read a few paragraphs at the beginning as part of your intro, your introduction, and a few paragraphs at the end as part of your conclusion. Nice thing about textbook chapters, it's very easy to find the introduction part of the chapter and the conclusion. Sometimes it's just spelled out for you. It'll say introduction or objectives, and at the end it'll say conclusion or summary. So the preview is simply getting a big picture view. What is this chapter or this article or this information that I'm about to read? What is it generally going to talk about? Now, the second step is an overview. And an overview is where you want to drill down a little deeper and get the big concepts, the big ideas that are going to be discussed in the chapter or in that article. So if you were reading a chapter or something very technical that had a lot of headings and subheadings, what you want to do during this step is simply read those headings, the subheadings, boldface words, anything that pops off the page. Now, let's say you don't have any headings or subheadings. What you could do is simply read the first sentence of every single paragraph. And why would you read the first sentence? Because the first sentence tends to be the main idea of the paragraph. It's not always the case, but usually the first sentence will tell you the main point. And if you read all the first sentences, or if you look at all the headings, subheadings, and boldface words, you'll get a really good idea of what that chapter or what that article is going to be about. And this step shouldn't take you all that long. But once you're done with this second step, the overview, you're on to the third step, reading. And that's pretty self-explanatory. Reading is just, going beginning to end. The problem here is that most people start with this step. A lot of people start off just reading everything beginning to end as if there's this unsaid rule that everything needs to be read beginning to end. And for almost all informational material, reading something beginning to end is probably the worst way that you can read it. Why? Because you don't know what you're getting yourself into. By doing a process like this, a preview, an overview, and then reading the material, you have an idea of what you're getting yourself into, and you could read it. Usually, if you do this kind of a process, you'll be able to read a little faster at this step because you know what to expect. You'll be able to comprehend better because you know what to expect. And what about your retention? We talked earlier about how retention is largely a function of repetition. Look at all the repetition going on in this process. We have 3 different steps. And you can actually get more repetition in this process if you combine it with taking notes, as we were discussing earlier. So what I would do if I really needed to know my information inside out in a lot of detail, what I would do is I would preview the material, but then I would take some notes based on that preview. So you might add some information to your mind map. After I preview and take some notes, I would overview the material, and then I would take some notes based on that overview. And then, of course, I would be reading, and every so often while I was reading, I would be taking some notes. And you can get multiple repetitions by doing this kind of a process. So keep in mind this process can be applied in a lot of different ways. It works really, really well if you apply this to technical information, but the central concept is still the same. Repetition is going to help you to remember everything that you read. Now, when I say everything, I don't mean you're going to memorize it verbatim. If you need to memorize something verbatim, well, you might have to actually recite the lines out loud. If you think about how actors remember things, how do they remember their lines? They have to read the script and recite it over and over. So it's still repetition that's involved. Now, what are some other simple ways that you can get repetition in to remember more of what you read? Another simple way to do it is just talk about what you just read. After you're done reading something, if you can talk about it in your own words, that's kind of like learning it a second time over. Or if you can teach the topic to someone else. I've heard this phrase before, when you teach something, you learn it twice. And teaching is just another way, or talking about something is just another way to get that repetition in. Now let's talk about some other ways that we can remember what we read. One way to do it is to use mnemonic devices. Now, mnemonic devices help you a little more with the recall of information. So this you see on your screen right now is a mnemonic device, Roy G. Biv. It's a mnemonic device for the sequence and the colors of the rainbow. So some of you are probably already familiar with it. The R stands for red, the O stands for orange, and so on and so forth. So if you remember the name Roy G. Biv, this is a popular mnemonic device to remember the colors and the order of the colors in the rainbow. Now, there's all sorts of mnemonic devices, and what they help you with is recalling information that you already learned in the past. So here's a mnemonic device a lot of us are probably familiar with. When you're trying to remember the notes on a treble clef, the every good boy deserves fudge. Or I remember learning it as every good boy does fine. Or the word face. That will help you remember the notes. There's mnemonic devices for remembering how many days are in a month. So, for example, you know how January has 31 days. Sometimes we forget, does it have 30 or 31 days? And you can use actually your knuckles, they call this a knuckle mnemonic, to remember how many days are in a month. So January, because it's a knuckle, it has 31. February, that's an easy one to remember. Because it's between the next knuckle, we know it has 28 or 29. March, it's a knuckle, so that's 31. April, and you can go on from left all the way to right, and you'll notice that this mnemonic device works really well if you're trying to remember that. But how would you use mnemonic devices? Well, one way to do it is to try to construct one on your own. So there's various ways you can construct them. You could try to use an acronym like a name. Sometimes rhymes will help. There's also another way that you can do it, actually. If you think about whatever it is you have to remember, chances are you're not the only person out there that's had to remember that information. So if you're studying medicine or law or business, certain topics have been, learned by a lot of people. So you can probably do a Google search. And what I would recommend you do is whatever you're trying to remember, just search for mnemonic device and whatever that topic is. And you'll usually find some sort of blog post or someone that's written about a clever mnemonic device for remembering this. I'll give you an example. For if you have to remember, let's say, the systems of the body for nursing students or someone that's studying medicine, there's mnemonic devices on that. There's mnemonic devices on all sorts of things. So sometimes it's just better to Google that information and look for it. Otherwise, you'd have to come up with some sort of a name or an acronym. Now, let's talk about an exercise that we can do to improve our retention, because if you've ever played a sport or an instrument, you know that practice is how you get better at things. Well, you can actually practice and improve your ability to remember what you read. And a simple way to do this is to try doing an exercise called the read and recall exercise. It's very simple, and all you have to do is you read a paragraph of text, and then you take a quick note. And when I say a quick note, I mean a keyword or a phrase. We're not trying to write down a full sentence of what we just read. So you don't have to write down, this paragraph is about blah, 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 blah. You're just writing down a keyword or phrase that'll remind you of what that paragraph was about. And then you just repeat this process. You read a paragraph, you take a quick note. You read another paragraph, you take a quick note. Now, by the way, if you come across some paragraphs that are just 1 or 2 sentences long, you don't have to take notes after that. But every time you come across a lengthy paragraph, you want to take a quick note about what that paragraph was about. And what this does is it allows you, it's almost like you're quizzing yourself every time you finish reading a paragraph. And this actually helps you improve your retention. You don't have to do this exercise indefinitely, so I'm not recommending that you do this on every single piece of material that you read from now until the day you die. What you want to do is use this read and recall exercise as a way to improve retention as a form of practice. So try doing this maybe 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And what you'll notice is that you'll be better focused on your material, because if you have to take a note after each and every paragraph, you're going to pay attention a little more, and you'll start noticing that your ability to remember what you read is going to increase because you're constantly paying attention. And remember, we said earlier, paying attention is always the first step to remembering something. Now, if you're interested in improving your memory further, we actually have a memory course that goes into a lot deeper. This topic that we're covering today was focused on remembering more of what you read, but if you're interested in topics like how to remember names better, different memory techniques and strategies, different tricks that will help you remember maybe a presentation that you might have to do, the memory course is a good option for you. It's got 10 class videos, over 7 hours of unique content. And you can find that information. The link is on your screen right there, irisreading.com/online-courses. Also, we have other courses that you can check out. These courses we offer online or in person. So we have courses on speed reading, comprehension, productivity, how to improve your focus. We even have a mind mapping course. If you want to organize one of these workshops at your company or your school, you can email support@irisreading.com. Or if you wanted to take them online, you can just go to the link we mentioned earlier, which was irisreading.com/online-courses, and you could check them out there. But I want to thank you all for attending the webinar. If you do have questions, feel free to email me. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, feel free to do so. Again, thank you so much for attending the webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.